Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast.
Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure, which is a very broad umbrella, I agree, but most of my time I spend talking about astrology with famous astrologers from around the globe who enlighten us about interesting topics, and we sort of take a glimpse of what's going on. Sometimes we have a topic and sometimes we don't, but the times are so fervent and fruitful with action going on that it's hard not to find a topic to talk about, especially given the light of the current proceedings that are going on in the world as we speak. My guest is going to be on in a few minutes. Before we start, though, I want to remind you about my newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, you'll find a couple of paragraphs of mundane astrology. That's as it applies to all of us on the planet. And then I break it out in the individual signs. I also have links in there to my podcast archives, which go back for 13 years of interesting shows, really informative stuff there, as well as links to my television station channel as well, which is also about astrology education, as well as interesting topics with interesting people I've run across over my time. I am a self-serving entity, meaning that I survive on the goodwill of those of you who contribute to me. So I appreciate those of you who send in contributions. You can do that through PayPal. You can find a PayPal button on my website, chrisflisher.com or turningofthewheel.com, and also in my newsletter as well. Those of you who do contribute, I'm very grateful for your participation. It allows me to keep this great wheel turning. So without further ado, let's get my guest on. My friend, dear good friend, Tad Mann, is going to be on today. We're going to be talking about sort of the swirl of emotion and activity that we're in right now with regard to Mercury retrograde, the House impeachment. There's a lot of topics that are here. And before we get Tad on, I just want to make a quick point, and I hope I'm speaking for him too. When we speak about political topics and we use the term astrology in the same frame of mind, we are speaking as reporters. We're not speaking with a political bias. Now, we may have a bias. You probably already know my bias, but I want to be fair and offer the idea that we are trying to approach this from a very scientific and methodical approach, educational approach, because the aspects today are so perfectly right on for what we're going through that we have to defer to that. And this is not about political commentary. So if you hear us making some comment about what's going on, it is directly tied to the astrology. So I just want to put that out there and hope Tad feels the same way. Anyway, Tad, welcome to the show today. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Chris.
I mean, you must share my sentiment, right, about the aspects.
That's actually, of course, that's a very interesting topic. I try to make that clear with the newsletter that I send out every new and full moon also, which is that it is actually particularly interesting right now because I tend to take a slightly more pessimistic approach to things in general.
Yeah, well, it's probably safe.
Rather
probably a good
than
idea.
Other newsletters that I see from astrologers who kind of paint a really nice picture with Neptune and Pisces, that, it's absolutely wonderful, things are flowing in your spiritual life, whereas I think of it much more as being fake news.
Yep, I think fake news is perfect for that appropriate.
A difficulty of the truth. And of course, the issue around newsletters, and you know this as well, is that, a planet like Neptune is in Pisces for 15 years.
Right.
And Uranus is going to be in Taurus for the next 7 years. And so it actually, there is a repetitive quality to it. But I think that, and you probably would agree with this, that, it's almost as though we can see things beginning to form towards what looks like a kind of major collision in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that Saturn and Pluto are two of the main participants in it, but also it's something that's affecting the U.S. in particular, because the U.S. chart sun obviously is in the sign Cancer. You think of the 4th of July.
Right.
And that next year, Pluto is going to be Pluto and Saturn are both going to be passing over the opposition point to the sun of the U.S. chart. And, I mean, this is already happening in the outer world, and it's happening in the inner world also.
Mm. And we just need a fast-moving inner planet to trigger some of these events, and it will set off the sort of the explosion. And what's interesting, I think, of course, we are unique in this regard because we are a fairly young country. So we have not really experienced a Pluto return before, and we've seen that in other countries. If you look back through history, we see big things happening to countries that are much older than ours. But I think this is a new thing for us, and we are seeing. This is the point I was trying to make in my intro, is that a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, whether you are a right-winger or a left-winger, you cannot deny the fact that the astrology is spot on for the time. We are gearing up for a major reconstruction of a whole basic premise of our democracy, I believe. I think we're getting tested in every way. I think what emerges is going to be a much different animal.
I agree. And that's one of the main functions of Saturn, of course. I mean, Pluto tends to be something that represents quite a complete disruption, meaning the breakdown or death of a particular behavior pattern leads to a recreation of that pattern. But Saturn is also a reinforcing agent in the sense that it does represent the idea of reconstructing and redefining things. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And it when these two come together, it's quite a flagrant combination in a way because they're both in Capricorn, which is extremely patriarchal. And when I say that, I mean that the patriarchy has been in control for thousands of years, not just hundreds of years. But remember that our country was formed by a group of men.
Yeah.
How many women do you ever see when you look at the founders of the U.S.? And so the dynamic that I believe is really an undercurrent and a very powerful one to what's going on right now is it needs a kind of recorrection towards this idea of allowing the feminine dynamic to reach a different kind of balance with the patriarchy, which actually, having been in control for so long, most of the destructive energies that we see right now, I feel, can be attributed to that.
I do too. It's spot on. I mean, the fact that we have a misogynist in the White House and who's getting taken down by, has been taken down and called out by women through the Me Too generation and everything else that goes through that movement, it's absolutely spot on. And I think that Saturn being involved with Pluto tends to be like the mother or the adult in the room. I think of Saturn as saying, okay, let's do the right thing here. If we're going to deconstruct this and reconstruct this, we're going to do it right. And I think that's what we will see manifest, hopefully, as Saturn tends to move into Aquarius over the next year or so. I think that's going to be important there. But that's just
and I also, it's interesting for me because being in Capricorn, it's flat out patriarchal.
Yeah.
In the movement of, obviously, both planets are headed towards Aquarius. Saturn's going to get there much earlier than Pluto. But I always think there's a very funny paradox involved with Saturn and particularly with Aquarius. And I think a lot of my Aquarius clients probably are aware of this. And indeed, I've had relationships with Aquarian women. But the way I see Aquarius is very curious because it's ruled by both Saturn and Uranus. And the Saturn part of it loves the idea of things being written in stone because it brings a kind of security and stability. But Uranus, of course, is also a ruler of Aquarius, and it represents the tendency to feel trapped by the very structures that one creates. So I would think the relationships that we create end up eventually leading towards a kind of almost like a deconstruction of them, meaning that you basically want to free yourself of the structures that you yourself create.
Right.
I always jokingly say about Aquarians that they like the idea of relationships more than being in them.
They do. It's sort of the collective idea. Yeah, it's that collective idea that they enjoy. I see Saturn in Aquarius along the lines of, I see it speaking to the collective. I think of Aquarius as being sort of the larger collective. And with Saturn there, it's sort of heralding us to join together to resolve a problem that we all share, because the focus will be on the collective, the mass body of all of us. So we all have a responsibility to step in. And I think what unites us in this current iteration and going forward will be the climate. The climate is what we all share universally, regardless of where we live or our religious beliefs or political beliefs. We are all impacted by the outside of the climate. And I think Saturn moving into Aquarius does bring about the idea of, okay, guys, you have to work on this collectively, do the right thing, clean up your act. And then, of course, that's where the destruction of Pluto comes in, and then we reconstruct in a better way, hopefully.
Yeah, and obviously it's happening. It is way out of whack, and no matter who you are, you've got to acknowledge that. And I think that linkage between the feminine and the environment, because the Earth is always seen as being Gaia, who is,
Mother Earth. That's right. Yeah.
Mother, and it is Mother Earth, and so the whole idea is that, and I'm writing about this in a book that I'm doing now called The Serpent's Dream. But the issue of it is that if you demean women and put the feminine down and don't allow its needs to be expressed clearly in your world, then guess what? The environment is going to be the place where that difficulty is going to be expressed and communicated.
That's right.
I think in order to change our view of the environment and to correct it in such a way that we're going to be safe in the future instead of in a dire situation, is to begin to revere the feminine again. I think the two are so intimately connected that and Saturn, of course, is the ultimate patriarchy, and it's at the boundary of as you mentioned just before, it's at the boundary of the inner planets, which are personal, all the planets up to Jupiter, and the outer planets like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto that are collective. And it is that interaction. And I think, the focus on the news, on not being able to believe the news, is, of course, a bit of a shock, and it really echoes that particular dynamic.
It sure does. And, the overarching theme as well, speaking to what you just were talking about, is ultimately we are supposed to be in an equal relationship between positive, negative, black and white, up and down, male and female. We're supposed to we live in a dualistic world that strives on equality, and equality has not been there for the longest time. This is a major, paradigm shift of the highest order, and it's a slow-moving train, yes, but still it's there, and it's going to happen. I believe that's very much the case.
No question about it, and you can see it all over. I mean, it's not, the Me Too is it on a very personal level, on a very sexual level, but it's true in terms of the equality of jobs, and it's also true in terms of the presence of the feminine dynamic in the culture in general. Right. In fact, a very good friend of mine, I did some events at the Rubin Museum not this last summer, but summer 2018. I
remember, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And one of the events I did with a futurologist called Skylar Brown. And one of the things we were talking about is what she does, which is that she was working for many, many years to attempt to bring some kind of feminine, intuitive magic to the corporate world, which is almost 100% masculine.
Right.
Just needing a kind of sensitivity to the overall good and some kind of balance and equilibrium. I was listening the other day to financial news, which I almost never do because it isn't one of the most interesting things in the world to me. But the gist of it is that I realized that the pathology of this country and of this time, which is that they were saying that growth, it has to continue and get greater and greater and greater. And I think that's a kind of sickness, because when things continue to grow, you see the inequality increases, the difficulty that people at the bottom of the scale have increases, the overuse of the oceans, of the air, of the purity of the world in general is all at risk. And it's because of that principle, that philosophy.
And that philosophy really that's a capitalistic philosophy that we have to continue to grow. And if you don't grow, if you can't be stagnant, because then you have this sort of implosion, which could precipitate a financial collapse, which I do believe is on the horizon at some point in time. You can't just keep growing. I mean, things just burst. I mean, you've seen these gigantic pumpkins. Here it is, Halloween. You might as well talk about a pumpkin. But a gigantic pumpkin, if it continues to grow, becomes untenable. It's unmanageable. So think of the world in the same way. And the thing you're talking about here is spot on, because we have this enormous inequality, and the scales are really tipping. We see the slow motion of it happening, but it's there. This is how these slow things happen. History is a very wide arc. And the time it takes to make changes.
And also it affects the collective economy.
Yes.
You know,
exactly.
that it's happening on a worldwide level right now. It's not just this country either.
Oh, no, I
You
know.
see the same issue. Brexit in the UK is around the same issues. It's the patriarchy trying to hold on to things to benefit itself rather than actually spreading the wealth, actually creating a different kind of equality and moving in a much different direction. You know, I lived for 30 years in England and Denmark, which are both socialist countries, which in this country seems like a kind of bad term somehow. People shy away from it as though it's toxic, but actually, on the contrary, it's actually an incredibly beneficial thing. And I just really wonder that our perspective is so out of joint that this Saturn-Pluto dynamic, I think, is its main function is to try to bring some kind of sanity back into the equation, because I really question the sanity of a lot of people who are running things these days.
I know, I do too. I think we're too far down the road with regard to the, sort of how we repair these things. We're almost too far down the road. How do we pivot from the democracy to a social democracy? It's going to be difficult, but I think that it starts with getting that money at the top of the chain down into the masses, and that is essentially, those are the roots of revolution right there. When people below get so mad at those at the top that have way too much, that's an imbalance in itself. So we're talking about lots of imbalances, whether it be income inequality, whether it be sexism and the lack of equality between male and female, whatever it may be. They're very powerful themes that need to be. I think the reason they're so fervent and so volatile in our lives on a daily basis, that we're so observant of them, is because this heightens our attention to the fact that they've got to be changed, and we've got to brace ourselves for this change.
Chris, but also just think about the resonance of the Pluto cycle with America, because that time in the 1700s,
right,
when the revolution occurred, guess what? That was a revolution, and guess what? Triggering it with Pluto's going to do.
Right.
It could easily produce another revolution, and that needs to happen in a way.
It does need to happen. And the question, I guess the larger question would be, what does that revolution look like? Is it right versus left?
Sure.
Or is it up? Is it the rich versus the poor, or is it left wingers versus right wingers? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about civil war floating around.
Actually, they're very resonant in some way. I do think there's a parallel there for sure.
Yeah.
I think the right wing is much more patriarchal, the left wing is much more liberal, and I think it also has to do with who's got the wealth and who doesn't. That's really the big issue in the UK.
Yeah, just look at a picture of the House, of either the House or the Senate. You'll see a majority of old white men. I had one guy on who called him male, pale, and stale.
Exactly.
And they are. They're angry. They're old white men who have outserved their purpose, pushing their patriarchal agenda further down the road. But the time has come for that to change. I think that's a very valid point right now.
I think things like House and Senate limits, like
term limits for sure, of all people. And who brought that to
limits, where you get new people, you get younger people in government and people with more open minds to what could possibly. I'm not saying we need to become socialists by any stretch of the imagination, because that creates, there are issues with that as well. But,
right.
But I do really believe that something needs to loosen up, and I also think it has a lot to do with attracting younger people to their authority and their responsibility, which is also very, very Saturn Pluto in a way.
I mean, it's almost comical. It has to happen, because you can't live in a contemporary world with old-fashioned people. Some of these guys in the Senate, when they start talking about the web and cell phones, they are completely lost. They don't even know how to ask Mark Zuckerberg the right questions, because they're not familiar with the technology. They need somebody who's younger, who has lived with this, grown up with this technology, to be involved in those conversations. You don't need somebody who's in their 80s talking about how does the web work when they don't even have the first clue. They're still living with the old-fashioned telephones. So this has to be a contemporary. In order for us to evolve properly, we need to have those contemporary people be there, and those are the young folks. Those are the people who are going to get us through this mess.
But it's also ironic that not only, I mean, you're aware of this as well, but throughout the entire 20th century up until now, Neptune and Pluto have been traveling in a sextile relationship to each other. Mm-hmm. And so as dramatic changes happen in the world, the main response to them is very Neptunian, which is, I was amazed the other day, I live a couple of hours north of New York. And when I go down into the city, I walk down the street and you see every single person looking at a phone.
Right.
You look at people sitting down somewhere. You see people in a restaurant. I was in the line behind a young woman in Hudson, New York, which is where I live, just the other day. And I swear to God, she looked at her phone every 15 seconds. She was waiting in line for 3 minutes or 4 minutes, and she looked at her phone probably 15 times.
Right.
As though something is going to happen.
Well, you know what it is? It's also a default mechanism because you have to ask yourself, what did people do before they had these phones when they were standing in line? They were probably talking to each other. They were probably communicating, maybe having a little small talk between each other.
They were also thinking instead of acting mechanically.
Absorbing, exactly. Yeah, that is a real departure from what we've had to, but there are some good things to that because when we're speaking about the collective, what would unite us would be if we had a message coming out of that collective vehicle that was more unifying, that was more corrective, that was more, progressive. And that's where I think, this is a vehicle that can be used for good. I think right now, because the allure is so rich and pungent, people are just absorbed by looking at the screen and fascinated by the technology. But I think once that becomes more part of our daily parcel, we would begin able to look at that as a much more positive, outcome, because we could use the phone in a way that helps bring us collectively together.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate we don't see a lot of that these days. I mean,
No.
It's so funny. I had to take my computer in to be repaired yesterday. And just 24 hours, I realized everything I do in my life depends on that computer.
I know it is. We've
like
kind of backed ourselves into a corner.
It's a very strange situation because of course, I have other devices here that I'm talking on right now, but the idea basically that it's almost as though they occupy so much space in one's life that it's very, very difficult to go back to really just thinking about things and taking things and being mindful about things. Right. In fact, for me, writing a book is actually that process, which is
you can't write a book on a phone.
Away from the computer. I have to really put them down and say, I'm not taking any phone calls. I'm not looking at any emails for the next 2 hours because I'm going to write.
Yeah.
And so it's a very good antidote, but not many people do that. And I think it's a great lack, and it leads to a whole change in the view of, in the sense of foresight and people kind of thinking about where they are instead of just automatically responding and reacting to what comes in on that little device.
It is remarkable. The other day I left the house, and for some reason I didn't take my phone with me, and I was at the store. I'm like, oh my gosh, where's my phone? I can't find my phone. I thought I lost it. Then I realized I left it home. And I panicked for a minute, to be honest, because I was like, oh, my God, people can't reach me. But what did they do 20 years ago if they couldn't reach me? They would wait till I got home or whatever. It's not like the sky was not falling. I was able to get through it. It just was remarkable, just sort of it was a very visceral kind of reaction I felt, like, oh, my gosh, I lost my phone. And yet I knew it was safe, so I didn't have to worry about it. It was just a matter of who's going to call me in the next 15 minutes. Nobody's going to call me in 15 minutes.
By the way, I think it's good to actually to work with that a bit. Like I play golf still, and we're really done for the year at this point. I mean, the end of October is really one of the last days. But the gist of it is that whenever I go play, and I'm out there for 4 hours, basically, we're out there walking around in nature, and it's wonderful. I don't ever take my phone.
Good, that's great.
I mean, I'm not likely to receive calls, but also I wouldn't take them anyway. So, but I think it's actually very helpful to to have situations like that where
right.
you get a chance to just be free of that kind of, interruption in one's life. Because
unless there's that day that you get the hole in one and you want to document it.
Then you take the phone out and take a photograph. I mean, come on.
You want to be able to document that hole in one.
Yes, exactly.
Oh my gosh. I got a hole in one time, and it was completely by fluke. I was at the green tee.
Always are,
of course they are. I know, it's never planned, and I couldn't even see the flag because it was down a hill. So you just had to hit the ball with cast your fate to the wind, and sure enough, it just landed on the green and rolled right in. Now, I had witnesses, so.
Well, actually funny. I've had 2 holes in one over the years. I mean, in the last 35 years, And in both cases, I did not see it, but someone else did.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's probably that's poetic justice in some way. But getting back
It
to
is.
the idea of the devices and the way they rule our lives, I think it's a great time for people to become, revert back to sort of the more mechanical kinds of hobbies that you and I both enjoy. We both are artists. We both draw mandalas.
Yeah.
I've been itching to get back into my drafting table and to start drawing again.
Sure.
Because it's a real good manifestation of creative energy that does not involve devices. It's a mechanical, organic, from my amygdala, down my arm, into the pen, onto the paper. It's a remarkably refreshing exercise and really resonates with me in ways that a phone would never come
feel
close.
it. It's. I remember, because you and I have been making those mandala images forever.
Yeah.
And I remember back in the beginning when I was in my 30s, which is now a hell of a long time ago, but the gist of it was that I felt that so much of my education at Cornell and doing architecture existed in my head, that my head was getting way out of balance with the rest of me, and that making these mandalas, making these images, first of all, it's a logical process, but at the same time, it's also about how we feel and how we respond naturally to the world. And I kept thinking it was bringing me back into my body, which was almost like a therapeutic operation.
Oh, I think it's very therapeutic. I think therapeutic is the word I would use every time. For me, the mandala has been nothing but therapy. I enjoy doing them. I get a great deal of pleasure out of working with color and line and function and form and angle. Love all those things. But for me, it was purely therapeutic. It was a way for me to put my emotions, my moods into a vessel that could then give back out in some creative way. So the best way to abscond or get over any sort of traumatic experience in your life is to go through this process of giving out, and as a result of giving out, you sort of relieve yourself. And it's that very mechanical quality. You can't get that you can't even get it when you're typing. You can get it when you're writing a journal by hand with a pen, but you can't get it by typing. I always tell people when I talk to clients, I say, why don't you try journaling? I said, but don't use it. Don't do it on your computer. Do it by hand, so you can get the real organic quality of hand to paper. It's something very visceral about that.
Well, yeah, and it restores the balance in a way. I think it also is under the rulership of Saturn and Pluto. That it really does. We really do need to go back to more direct forms of communication, and because it turns out that the media is actually interacting in the truth. They're just as much to blame as the politicians are.
I think so too.
Because
yeah.
in a way, it's like you begin realizing. Like even the difference between Europe and America. That in Europe, you actually find out about what's going on in the rest of the world. If you watch ABC or CBS or NBC News or Fox News, you never find out about what's going on in the world unless it's a kind of feel-good story, at the end of the news to kind of, with a wry sense of humor. But that's nothing compared to what's really going on out there.
Oh, there's so much stuff we're not seeing.
More and more intense.
Yeah, there's so much stuff we're not seeing, and that's a real problem. It's cherry-picked because it's cherry-picked for entertainment value in some ways. It's got a certain addictive quality to it. So that's what people draw back to. They get pulled in by this addictive quality, and they find out only a very narrow range of what the news is actually about.
Yep.
Yeah, we're talking today with Tad Mann. His website is atmann. It's atmann.net, atmann.net. I encourage you to go there. He's written a fascinating number of books, many of which are my favorite astrology books, as well as great information about, he does work with mandalas, he does work with tarot cards, he's involved with many different things. He's got his fingers in a lot of pies, but an absolutely brilliant man with regard to the whole, what I call the homogenation of all the esoteric arts. They're all there. So I encourage you to check that out. We'll take a quick break and we'll be back. We'll continue our discussion about where we are in the world today, because we are certainly in a moment in time that is unprecedented. So we'll be back in about 2.5 minutes. In the meantime, check out Tad's website, atmann, atmann.net, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Hang in there.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.turningofthewheel.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. And enter a world of possibility and color.
Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Tad Mann. His website is atmann, atmann.net. And we've been talking about sort of where we are and how things look. We are on the cusp today, no pun intended, of a Mercury retrograde. And we just see a lot of activity happening down in Washington, D.C. We see Saturn and Pluto both in Capricorn, which is a cardinal earth sign, which means that there's a lot of activity has to take place with regard to how we restructure the earth. The earth is speaking back to us in wildfires and floods and rising sea tides. These are all harbingers of what's to come, and they are strong alarm systems that we need to pay attention to so that we can address them as we go forward, because the destruction is going to happen, and it is going to be reconstructed. There's good news there, and each of us has this happening in our lives someplace. There's some place in each of our lives where things are being torn down to be reconstructed for a better purpose, and it's a difficult challenge to go through. It's trialsome. It's very onerous and tedious, and you may be saying goodbye to things, parts of your life that you don't want to say goodbye to, but in that release, there's great freedom at the other end. We just don't know it's there till you get there, but supposing it's better than where you've been. So, I think this is a very important time, Tad. I think that, the cardinality quality is cardinality is where things all begin, and this is being an earth sign, we have to begin somewhere, and this is where we are. And
also, of course, Mars is squaring both Saturn and Pluto these days, and that's going to continue for a period of time. And we see, it's almost as though a lot of these situations are really reaching a breaking point in a way, and one can expect kind of irrational and possibly even violent things to happen. And it's not a nice thing to see, but also it's reaching a point where it's really quite warranted. It's like, because Capricorn and Saturn both really want to maintain and sustain things as they are, right? Which is really problematic. Stability. When everything else, people want stability at some level, but also when it becomes, kind of toxic as it has become, it's important to really kind of break out of the loop in some way and to open things up in a different direction. Right. And I think that's part of the challenge. That's what the Pluto-Saturn challenge really is, because if Saturn wants to have stability and
a strong foundation, yet that's being shaken at its core because of all the external activity going on. Mars-Pluto is a very powerful, square. I have it in my chart natally, but so I can speak to it pretty clearly. But it is something that can trigger action, and that kind of triggering action can come about, which sets in motion where we can see the changes happening, where we can see the motion going. It can be very exciting if perceived the right way. And I think you would appreciate this. It's more like giving into the flow of a river. You can't swim up that river. You got to go with the stream. And if the stream is taking us one way, you're better off going with the stream, even if it may be unpleasant and bumpy at times. But, when you come out the other end, you maybe come out in a wonderful spot, and hopefully not over the waterfall.
Right. Well, something I noticed the other day, which is interesting, and I don't know whether you've really picked up on this yourself, Chris, that we're in a very strange time because Neptune is in Pisces, which it rules.
Right.
And Saturn is in Capricorn, which it
rules.
And Jupiter is in Sagittarius, which it rules.
Yeah.
Mars is in Libra, which is the opposite to the sign that it rules.
Right.
Uranus is in Taurus, which is opposite to the sign that it's exalted in, which is Scorpio.
Right.
So almost every planet is in a sign that's either the place where it's supposed to be or it's opposite.
Or it's opposite. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I think when it's in its opposite, even though it may be debilitated in some ways, it still has great value. I still see great value in Mars in Libra, even though it's not considered to be a good placement. I think of it as a striving for equality, which, again, brings us back to that same subject we were talking about. Now, granted, Mars is not there for that long, but still, it does light the fuse, so to speak.
No, there's no question. And by the way, Venus is in Scorpio, which is the opposite to the sign that rules also.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So it's like there are as many planets in their own sign as there are planets in the opposite sign. And I see that as being it's a kind of inner tension in a way.
Oh, very strong.
That has got to exist within each of us in the same way that we're watching it in the collective, which is probably more concentrated version of it. But it's happening in our individual lives also. It is a kind of endemic situation right now, and it's certainly worth figuring out and looking at because it's very valuable to see how these things all interact with each other, which they're doing right now.
And how it plays out in an individual chart. And the only way to really understand that, those of you who are listening, is to really get a real chart reading from somebody who knows what they're talking about, who can guide you and say, this is where your activity is going to be. Are you having to leave your house? Do you have to break up? Do you have to leave your job, for example? Do you have to? Any number of things could be there, and the handwriting is literally on the wall, at least it's on the chart, where you can see this destruction happening. And people want to resist this sort of change. We do not like change as a rule overall, but I always say you could be in a relationship with somebody for 20 years and you sort of fall into a groove where you know what you can get away with, what you can't get away with. Even the same thing is true with a job, but you may not be all that happy in there. You get stale, you get complacent, you become, disinterested. But you're afraid to move because you don't know what's on the other side. But then you move just by quirk or by fate or by some sort of thing that happens in your life. You move and you're like, wow, why did it take me so long to move? I'm in a much better place now. That is always an option. Yeah, it can be worse, but I tend to think that when these kinds of outer planets are moving like this, they are actually pushing us in a better direction, part of an evolutionary process on our each individual level as well as the collective level.
Well, I think, of course, that's a very interesting principle for astrologers, but also for people in general. We're just looking at things in two ways. We're looking at it in terms of our personal experience, but also in terms of the structure of things. But I always feel that the outer planets in particular, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, which are all actually and Saturn as well, which are all in very potent places right now, that the nature of them is very interesting because the way it works, and this is particularly true of Saturn and Pluto, but also Uranus and Neptune as well, which is that with these outer planets, if you don't actually take advantage of this push to change and resist it and deny it, it will force you to.
Mm-hmm.
And what leads to it from that is you have a lot less choice.
Right.
And you're going to be a lot less happy about the outcome because when it's forced upon us, it always feels to us as though it's fate, and it's something that we can't resist in any way. But I really believe we can. I think that it's very important to know about these influences. I mean, this is what I embody in the newsletters that I do. That of course, unless you know really the nitty-gritty of what's really going on, it's not really possible to see it in your own life as well. You know, it's a lot easier to say, you know, I can see it in this politician as being a complete idiot, but then when you realize that you look in the mirror, maybe you're acting like a complete idiot, it's a whole other proposition. Mm-hmm. And that I do think there's a very powerful karmic dynamic going on right now, simply because of that, because these outer planets are running wild, they're running loose, and it's affecting all of us profoundly. Look at California. I mean,
it's incredible. I know. That's what brings you back to the environment as being the major topic. I mean, California is getting consumed. I mean, I'm not even sure. I can't even wrap my head around it. It's like apocalypse now out there. It's just, it's very upsetting to watch. Especially when you think about what's going on. How now California's always been seen as the land of glory, and here we are in the midst of this terrible. And it really is a manifestation of Gaia, like you say. It's Gaia responding back. And saying, get your act together, get your house in order here.
And now it's happening in the wine growing area, which is very Capricornian. Capricorn represents fermentation.
Yeah.
Capricorn's about wine and that area, Napa and Sonoma and those places.
All earth-based,
worst hit right now. And that whole earth-based economy around the world is really suffering profoundly. I think we really owe it to ourselves to kind of know more about these kinds of things. And, I do think that programs like yours, Chris, and the newsletters I send out, any of you, by the way, who are interested in having them, just email me at atman@atman.net and ask to send me your newsletter. I basically do them every new and full moon, but I really think it's my responsibility to educate people about the bad news as well as the good news.
Oh, I agree.
And actually to be able to see those things on a local level, we can do more about them than if we see them on a level that's overwhelming and more national. It's something and that's why I write books as well. It really starts at home, and it starts in our lives and our own sense of ecology, our own sense of, attaining a kind of natural health and so on. Mm-hmm. And I think the time is really coming that we need to wake up and be more mindful about our being on this planet.
I mean, that's really our goal. I mean, I see my goal as much the same. I think the reason I do this show and talk about educational concepts and with people such as yourself is to enlighten people as to what that goes. And it's also, I always say we are best prepared when we are best informed, and when we are, and to be forewarned is to be forearmed. Those both give us the insight as to what's going on. Now, we were talking about this whole conundrum. I think you and I were talking about this back in 2008. I think we had a conversation about when Pluto first stepped into Capricorn. I think we had a conversation. It's probably in my archives. If you go back in my archives, on my website, chrisflisher.com or turningofthewheel.com, you'll see we were already talking about the conversations back then and what that might look like. And we were talking very real terms about where we are now. So that's not a bias. That's not a political bias. That is we're looking through a lens that gives us insight into what we could possibly see.
Yeah, and it's also not something that's happened recently. It's been around for a long, long time, and it's kind of crazy that there were environmental concerns in our generation when I was in my 20s and 30s.
Oh, me too. I remember very much. Yeah, that's when Earth Day first started.
It was very much alive then, and actually we've done fuck all to correct it.
That's
true. It really is a time for action. Something really needs to happen, because also with a party in power in this country that's stonewalling those issues, it's just shocking. Mm-hmm.
But I have to say that there's a certain logic to some of what we're talking about that makes me think that this is how things happen. If there was not that sort of that blockage in the Senate and all those places like that, if there wasn't this egregious grab for money and the egregious grab for power, if it wasn't so blatantly obvious and so infuriating, none of us would move, because we can't move. We're not going to take action if we're complacent. We have to get angry in order for. That's what the squares are all about. That's what the oppositions are. When you get angry, you move. You can see it. Look at what's happening in Hong Kong.
Mars is in the equation.
Yeah.
And also when Mars is in the equation, that's also true.
Absolutely, yeah. And you look at what's happening in Hong Kong and other countries like that, and even in Chile, it's happening recently. And all through there's different hot pockets all around the globe where people are being tested by with the limits of power and the limits of money, and there are people that are beginning to fight back. It's just way out of whack.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I just accepted an invitation to go teach at a conference, interestingly enough, called the Age of Aquarius.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of funny, in Belgrade.
Good.
In Serbia, next March, around the equinox. And it's interesting because I've been to Serbia before and taught there before. It's where Tesla comes from. But,
yeah, I think
the dynamic of it is fascinating because things are so different there. It's like, for example, you go in a restaurant and everyone is smoking.
Yeah.
And like a waft of smoke comes out the door when you open the front door of the place.
Yeah, I know. It's very old.
It's so extraordinary. It's like you think, this is like going back in time. It's like going back 50 or 60 or 80 years. And it's very therapeutic to experience those things.
Oh, I think it's the more you can expose yourself to things that are different from what we see on a daily basis, the greater your perspective is going to be because you got more information to draw on. I think that the Age of Aquarius, I really do believe, there's a lot of hype around the Age of Aquarius, but I do believe that it's when Saturn and Jupiter arrive in, and they are conjunct in Aquarius. I don't have the date off the top of my head, but I know it's coming up the next year or so. When they arrive there, it's going to be a conversation about that subject. It's going to be a conversation about the collective and how we resolve the issues that we've created. I think that our attention is being brought to the problems now, and the resolution will come, I think, in that time. So it's going to be a long haul, but I think that we can be optimistic about the fact that it will eventually happen, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I do hope, of course, that does come about. But, also, I mean, I've actually written about things like this. I wrote a book called The Divine Plot. It was published in 1984, actually 86. But the whole dynamic of it is that, it's almost like history's cyclical.
It is.
And it really goes through cycles. It goes through destructive cycles in the same way that it goes through constructive cycles. And I think we're just in a cycle now, which is really a problematic one. And I think it's really causing us to wake up. At least I hope it is.
Yeah.
Even though I still look out there and I see, much of the world is just completely hypnotized.
Right. Well, that's Mark Twain was the one that said that. Mark Twain was the one that said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And that's so true because, that's the whole idea of the cycles. But, I always use the analogy of the corkscrew because as the corkscrew, you spin the corkscrew, you're going around and around, and so you're going to have a recurring theme, but you're going to be down the road in a different place, in a different time, different circumstances, so the outcome's going to be different, of course.
And fortunately, the cork will come out also.
Well, no, that's the good news. We want the cork to come out. But it's an interesting time, and I think that, nothing good ever comes easily. And if the roof did not leak, we would not fix it. Well, if the roof is leaking in our country, and that's a metaphor for any kind of problem you may perceive. If the roof is leaking and we don't fix it, then we're going to perish. So the roof is leaking, we have to repair it. So what else can we do? This is the lesson of the universe is teaching us.
By the way, Chris, I also saw another Mark Twain quote just last week. It said, that history it exists so people can re-experience it. And so I think the counter quote to that is something like, if you see it, if you understand how history works, then you can watch everyone else repeat it.
Yeah, it's true.
But it's a scary thought in either way. But I think it's far better to be able to observe it and to know what's going on rather than to be in the dark.
Yeah, but Mark Twain really, given his great knack for humor and his ability to forge words together, he's really a classic guy to be quoting these days. Because another one of his famous quotes is, "Babies and politicians should be changed on a regular basis." For the same reason.
I know. I agree completely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think that we could easily see a a lot of things change over the coming years. I mean, obviously change is inevitable. We all know that. That's sort of a foregone conclusion. But the degree to which they change, and if we move in a different direction, I think the idea of the divine feminine coming into light is a valuable and necessary swinging of the pendulum in the right direction. It's got to swing back this way in order for balance and equality to exist. And we have to be, we live in a state, our whole structure, down to the basic, core of our atoms is all about polarity, negative and positive. We've got to have that balance, otherwise things run askew.
I know, absolutely, no question about it.
Yeah. So when you think about this, I just still chuckling over babies and politicians should be changed on a regular basis. It's a great comment. I mean, he wrote that back in the 1870s.
I'm sure he laughed at his own jokes too.
Oh, he'd have to. I mean, they're so clever. How could he not? He was quite a character. Quite a character. Went through a lot of financial hardship sometimes, but he was really a brilliant man. So here we are, and I'm curious what you think. I mean, here we are on the cusp of a Mercury retrograde, or it's probably already gone retrograde at this point in time, but even leading up to it. And here we have, I think of retrogrades not necessarily as a run for the hills kind of moment, although I have had my moments where machines and computers and phones are broken. But I see it largely as a time to review, redo, reconsider. Anything with the prefix RE in front of it is applicable during a retrograde period, regardless of the planet. And with Mercury there, and this investigation just coming to become now, whereas official today, as a result of the pushing, this really allows them to review everything in a whole new light, because now the door has been opened, and once the cat's out of the bag,
it forces us to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have no choice.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. It is very, very valuable for us to just be in touch with what the hell is going on.
Yeah.
And it is an incredibly powerful opportunity to do that.
I mean, with Mercury and in Scorpio, I mean, it's going to go deep. It's going to go beneath the covers. It's going to dig up some dirt that we may not even be prepared for. I've always thought
Mercury is retrograde now, by the way.
Yeah, it is. I can see that. Yeah, I forget when it went. I think it went sometime early in the morning.
Yeah.
I've always held the contention that Melania Trump is a plant, and I've always thought, just to me, it doesn't seem that far-fetched. I mean, everything else in this thing is a farce, and it's surreal, so why wouldn't that be the case? I mean, who knows? I mean, that's not the furthest, that's the craziest idea. Maybe it is.
Might be, but yeah, I mean, I take your point, Chris, for sure.
So when we look at...
it's a fascinating time, and I think actually also, and I've said this before with you, I think that I don't really see Trump as the cause, but I do see him certainly as a symptom.
Yes, yeah, I think that's very true. Yeah, he's the catalyst. He's the one that lit the match.
He's certainly doing that, that's for sure.
And the fuse is slowly burning. And that's why I think that had he not arrived on the scene, had we continued what was there before, would we be as angry as we are now? Would we see the sort of the scandals coming out? Would we see the subterfuge if this had not been so corrupt? So this person was placed here to prepare us for the inevitability of things falling down, and he is tearing down huge parts of the government. The EPA is decimated, Department of State is decimated, so they've got to be rebuilt in a new and more formidable fashion that is more sustainable and more contemporary. Because a lot of these departments were set up probably back in the Roosevelt era or before.
Sure.
Maybe they need to be reinvented, reconsidered, reviewed. Here we go again with that word. Maybe they need to be redesigned for a more contemporary world. I mean, we didn't have cell phones back then. Maybe things are different now.
They definitely are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's it's a time that is very powerful, and it just fulfills a lot of obvious needs. There's no question about it.
So when you talk about when you're mulling over your ideas for the age of Aquarius, what are the big points that you're bringing up in there? You think it is about Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius?
I mean, obviously, Saturn and Jupiter go conjunct every 20 years, and in fact, they're moving into an air sign for the first time. And so I think that's quite a big change, but I just hope it leads to a different kind of view of the flexibility of things and the capacity to really restructure things that are going on. I mean, America's path over the years and over the centuries has been quite a rough one, and it's not all good. I mean, America hasn't always been an angel.
Oh my gosh,
no question about it, and particularly the case now. And I think that I actually grew up when I was a kid. I was really a historian more than an astrologer, and I studied it, and I think that it's very valuable to really look at those things. I think it really is a repetitive cycle, and it is. When you think of the Age of Aquarius, I always think of the 1960s musicals
right.
and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really like that. It's not just all love and light. It requires a lot of hard work. It requires a lot of dramatic change, and I think and hope that is happening.
Yeah, I remember seeing Hair when I was younger. I think I saw it actually in New York on Broadway, and it was really pretty interesting. I was fascinated by it at the time, and I actually thought back then that we were actually on the right road. But it was sort of a build me up buttercup kind of moment, because we sort of had this taste of what could be and what looked like it was going to work, the sort of the flower power communal kind of living. And I fully subscribed to that. I lived in a commune for a while, and I thought we had arrived. And then it all went to hell in a handbag once, the conservatives got in power and they started talking about trickle down economy, and then everything changed dramatically. So that was sort of maybe that was just a sneak preview of where we are headed. That's my hope.
Yeah, well, let's see. We will see shortly.
Hopefully we'll live long enough to be there. I mean, we won't get attacked by some foreign emissary or have some sort of other terrible terrorist thing happen as a result.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, all that's potential is there, too. But history does move through cycles of chaos, it seems like. I mean, the most dramatic changes that have happened to anything over any civilization has happened as a result of some sort of chaos at some point.
No question about it. No question about it. And we'll be helping you figure out how to do it, people out there.
Well, that is that's one of the joys of astrology. It gives us that foresight it gives us the language and the tools to frame the stories that we could possibly see unfolding. Now, when we talk about framing stories, don't forget stories can take many different ways, and the planets and the signs and everything else have a lot of different attributes that you can bring into it, which makes it into quite a heady stew. But still, having those stories out there can give you an inkling of which way the wind will be blowing. And I think that's what the value of astrology is. It's really unbelievable.
Absolutely. I agree with that completely.
Yeah. So what have you got cooking up in your personal world? You're going to be going to Serbia, you say, to do that? And
I'm going to Serbia in March. I'm going to the UK for the month of December and giving a talk in Brighton towards the end. And,
oh, good.
And I was actually just contacted this morning by one of the directors at the Omega Institute nearby.
Oh, yeah, good. Yeah, in
It's
Rhinebeck.
so funny because it's been 20 miles from me for 20 years. I've been there a few times. I've never done any work there, but apparently they're interested now in having me do some events there, which is great.
I think that's fantastic. I think that's a really good place to look at. It's a highly regarded area. I was working with a Buddhist monk for many years, about working on a book about karma, and he was giving talks there too. It's a very, very highly. It's a real feather in your cap to get there. I think it's great.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens.
No, I think it's great.
And also, we have an ISTAR conference in Chicago next year. I mean, in Colorado next year.
Yeah. I'm not sure I'm going to make it, but I know it's there. I might make it. I have no idea. It's true. They're well worth going to. I'll tell you right now. Anybody who's listening, if you haven't been to
Except we're not going to take the train this time.
No, I'm not doing that again. Interesting story. We took the train to the UAC conference in Chicago in May of 2018, I believe it was, and it all sounded great. Michael Luton set it up for us, and he was renting this Amtrak car, and the funny thing about it was that he didn't get enough astrologers to fill the whole car, but we had half the car filled with astrologers on our way from New York to Chicago on sort of this, mystery train of fun. But the irony of it all was that the other end of the car, of our car that we were in, the astrology car, was filled with Mennonites. And there was such a contrast, a juxtaposition of ideas to have families of Mennonites down one end of the car and all these astrologers on the other end of the car was just, I don't even know how you can describe that other than it was just pure comedy, I guess.
It was like a collision between the Aquarian Age and the 19th century.
Yeah, it's just what an of all people to land in the same car together. It just struck me as And it was a fun trip. I have to say it was fun, but I didn't sleep well, and it took me a while to recover because I was just, one of those things. But anyway, we've had a great conversation today, Tad, as we always do. I encourage all of you to follow Tad, get on his newsletter. You can get there from atmann, atmann.net. .net. Don't forget that .net. It's not .com. Or you can just Google A.T. Mann. You'll get it as well. And I encourage you to check out his books. If you want some really good foundational wisdom about astrology and the logic of how it works and how it fits into the overall plan, I encourage you to look into his books and definitely catch him if he's live sometime. Hopefully he'll still be live. And someplace where you can see him speak about some of these subjects. It's great to do that. So, Tad, thank you so much for coming on today. It's always great to talk to you.
Thank you, Chris.
All right. We'll be in touch soon. Take care.
As always. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.